Hello, my name is Joshua and this is the Power Recovery YouTube channel. And on today's little video, we're going to be talking about Orthorexia Nervosa. Now, most people don't even know about this eating disorder, and it is very hidden in society and it's almost kind of put on a pedestal, and a lot of people tend to get a lot of validation from this style of eating. And from my own personal experience with it, it got particularly pretty bad around 2011. But before I get into that, I want to kind of go over some of the symptomatology around orthorexia nervosa. Now, this is different from anorexia nervosa, where anorexia is predominantly focused on undereating and this fear of gaining weight. With orthorexia nervosa, the main premise with orthorexia is the quality of the food. It has to be a certain perfectionistic standard to be met. And it typically involves a very rigid palette of selection of foods to the point it starts to diminish a person's quality of life. So this isn't to say that eating healthy, whatever that might mean to you, having more nutrient-dense foods is bad, but it's when it's taken to the absolute perfectionistic extreme is where it becomes a massive, massive issue for a lot of people. Because at least I can only say on my part, where when I was really struggling with it in 2011, I had gone from a pretty traumatic experience in college where I didn't do particularly very well. I suffered with learning difficulties and I actually did really poorly. I even got a U in my music exam, which is an U for ungraded. And around that time, I was assaulted, trying to protect an older man. I didn't do particularly very well in college. I didn't really have a supportive network of friends. I was very isolated, and my parents were already separated at this point anyway. And it was a very stressful time for myself. I didn't really know what to do. 18, the only thing I wanted to do was music, and I was being told I wasn't very good at that. So what ended up happening was I began to overeat to kind of compensate and kind of submerge the emotions I was feeling. The shame, the guilt, the anxiety. I've always been a very anxious person, and that was a way I could essentially mood alter and get out of my feelings. And then what had ended up happening, because I had ended up gaining a lot of weight, I had actually was receiving at the time EMA money, which I don't think they do anymore, but you would get a certain amount of money for going to college, and I would spend all my money on food. So it got to the point then where I was eating tremendous amounts of food, high volumes, high calorie foods all the time in mass quantities. I was even having two 2-litre bottles of regular Coke on a daily basis. I was having tremendous amounts of Coca-Cola. And then what ended up happening was I gained a lot of weight, and people had started to make reference to that, and then there was a lot of weight-related teasing, which actually can be a common symptom with what can trigger people to have eating disorders, and one of the things. And what ended up happening then, as a way to kind of compensate for that and to kind of get out of feeling disgusted with myself, I had actually then started to restrict my eating. Now, because there is a small genetic link, and I'm talking, I don't know in terms of percentages, but I know it can be hereditary in some respect. If there's eating disorders in the family and they haven't recovered, there's a good chance they could pass some of these tendencies on to the child if the child's modelling the behaviours and the beliefs, etc. So what ended up happening what can happen is if you restrict your food intake and you go into a deficit, that can trigger someone going into anorexia nervosa and actually can make them want to and have the desire to overly restrict their food and be overly preoccupied with not gaining weight. So this was, at least in my experience for myself, very, very true, that was pretty much then the catalyst for me to then really restrict my food intake. I was having about 7 items of food per day. It started out very innocently. Again, this is the safe foods. I just felt as though one day when I had 7 items of food, there was no logic to this, like sometimes there isn't. What ended up happening was I felt as though I was slimmer one day having these, I counted on my hands 7 items of food. So I just kind of ran with that. And it kind of like with the addict, I think part of me that there isn't a logical side sometimes. There's this very big desire to take everything to the extreme and to get out of feelings and to essentially escape. So what ended up happening was I ran that protocol for quite some time, and just to give this reference of how much weight I had lost, the heaviest I've ever been, the same height I was when I was 18, the heaviest I've been was 210 pounds. At the point when I was doing this with the 7 items of food, the lowest weight I got to was 129 pounds at the same height, 6'1". So it's a lot of weight and big difference. And I was running the 7 items of food, and then what ended up happening was I kept then exchanging, well, I would class an item as food as, a tea with no milk or sugar, or it was a Diet Coke, and that was one of the 7 items. So you can imagine how low my calorie intake was. The premise of all this was a restriction and not to gain weight and lose as much weight as possible. And then what ended up happening was, because this has got pretty bad, I really exacerbated this when I began exercising as well, and I would go on runs for half an hour, and it started out pretty harmless, 2 to 3 times a week, 30 minutes, 20 minutes. And then because of the way I am with a lot of things, that I take everything to the complete extreme and become very obsessive, that I'd also taken the exercise then to the extreme as well. And I was doing 2 lots of cardio a day for 30 minutes in the morning and then 1 in the evening, and on the 7 items of food. So I'd lost a tremendous amount of weight. I actually have one picture where you can literally see the bones in my arms and in my hips. It's so prominent because of how much weight I had lost. And then it got to a screeching halt. I think my grandma had mentioned, said, I think you could be anorexic. And because I was in so much denial, and I had made my whole life about this way of life, no one had told me about this. And it was just something that I had done out of pure self-disgust. And again, there is that kind of small genetic link. It seems to run in family systems, that I just kind of ran with it. And I feel as though after that point, when I hit a screeching point, I got to a screeching halt. I got to then binge eating disorder. Because my body was so depleted and I was so hungry, a way I got out of that hunger and that emptiness was then I overate to camouflage the emptiness, to the point probably I would eat more than I'm eating now at a lower body weight. So I was gorging food, and then the next kind of stepping stone was getting out of the binge eating disorder. I noticed that a lot of the bodybuilders and the natural bodybuilders tend to eat a lot of food, and they were having 6 meals a day, and they had basically got to the point of you could be very, very lean with a lot of muscle mass. And that drew me in a little bit, because I was quite perplexed how they could eat so much food and not gain tons of body fat and still stay very muscular, and because of the way they train, the way they eat. So I kind of went into that world. And then because of, again, the obsessive nature of myself and that addict part of me of wanting to take everything to the extreme, I never did any steroids or anything like that. I never competed or anything like that. I always did it just recreationally. And I managed to put on a decent amount of muscle. I think I was only about 150 pounds, but from 129, I mean, that's, over a year or so, first year of training, that's still pretty good. And obviously, I gained some body fat as well. It's not all just muscle and water and etc. So, and then what had happened, because of the rules that come along with the bodybuilding scene at that time, eat every 3 hours, feed your muscle every 3 hours, protein, don't eat carbs past 6 p.m. or 5 p.m. depending on who says the rule. I didn't have any sugar. I didn't have any white flour. And because I had seen a video, particularly the 5 foods that work on YouTube, which is still on YouTube, I think, which was, if off the top of my head, I think it was brown rice, sweet potato, chicken, tuna, eggs, and then I think he said one of them is interchangeable, and then he said oats as well. I literally ran with that, and that became like my little meal plan, and it seemed plausible. It's all healthy, air quote, healthy food, whatever that means. And then what ended up happening, because these rules were engraved in me, and that around the YouTube scene around 2011, there was a lot of it. Isn't like how it is now, where there is a lot of influencers with millions of subscribers. It was all pretty brand new, and there was more channels being made and more people, posting their daily eating videos, etc., and day in the life and stuff like this. I'd actually then at that point was consuming quite a lot of content of other people doing the same kind of stuff I was doing, and being very regimented, only having the 5 foods that work. And then what had ended up happening was the YouTube scene began to shift, and it started to become more evidence-based, and a lot more of the kind of natural physique athletes were more looking towards like combining their video content with basically scientific data. And a lot of the rules that I was following were basically, they were saying were completely false. You don't need to do all this. You don't need to eat every 3 hours on the dot. You don't need to not eat any ounce of sugar in your life again. You can eat carbs at night. And because this was such a shock to my system, and because I'd basically wrapped my entire identity around, this kind of recreational bodybuilding, and it got so extreme with me in the sense of that I would become so regimented with my eating. I had a stopwatch. I timed my meals perfectly every 3 hours. I would cut off my carbs after 6, because obviously carbs, quote, store as fat late at night, which isn't true, even if you're in a calorie deficit. And then, because these rules, the rules that I was following started to basically impede my ability to function as a human being. All my relationships were destroyed. The last holiday I went on with my mum and little brother was completely destroyed. I even remember, because I was so preoccupied with food preparation so I could have these safe foods, that I actually brought on a couple of occasions food to a restaurant, which was really embarrassing. And I remember my little brother even recently saying, I don't understand why you did that. But obviously, when you're in the midst of an eating disorder, there is a kind of illogical component to this that to the outside world doesn't make sense, and that's okay. And it's something, you through a lot of rehabilitation, whether that's through psychological education on your part, or mindfulness, or researching things yourself, or getting professional help, which is what I really recommend, and maybe a combination of the two. It takes a long time to feel normal, or what we consider normal, and having a life of freedom with food, and enjoying what you're eating without being so concerned about your self-image, or having a rigid set of rules or guidelines to follow. And because the YouTube scene had become so evidence-based, and it completely contradicted everything I was previously doing, I had what the Japanese call the Satori experience, which means essentially awakening. And at first I resisted it so much because I was so angry that for the last year I'd suffered so much and put what I'd considered so much work in, that it was a massive shock to the system, and it was almost too much. And I carried on doing what I was doing for a little bit, but it did get to the point where I started to realise things around me, that my relationships were completely destroyed. I had so much toxic shame when I deviated away from a plan, or neurotic guilt. I had so much self-hatred. It was never, good enough. It was never, it was never on point. It was never perfect enough. And I'd become so overly preoccupied with buying food and preparing food in Tupperware that I had no time for anything else. And at the time when you're in the midst of something, just like an addict, that's all you really care about, and the rest of your life kind of falls apart. So on a moment-to-moment basis, I had this high level of anxiety. I had high level of distress. Any deviation away from that regimen, I would go into chronic self-hatred, toxic shame, just guilt. And because you are so hell-bent on dietary perfectionism and basing your diet on purity and all this, it becomes not just an obsession, but it becomes a very dysfunctional way of life, that everything else seems to be crashing around you. And this brings me to, in terms of the definition of health. Health really, it as much as it is a grey area, and there's a lot of definitions online, this is my interpretation. When you look at the definition of the word health and its German origin, and in its grassroots definition, it actually meant whole, so WH, whole. And when I think of health, I think of it as a whole systems approach towards health. It is something that amplifies and improves upon the whole system, so mental, social, physical, financial, emotional, spiritual, etc. It is not just a one-dimensional physical-only pursuit, that you're doing what most people do is they have an idealized false image in their head of themselves, and they will do whatever they want to and for however long they think they should to try and get that goal, and everything else is compromised in the pursuit of that goal. Because of the way, obviously, social media plays into things, it pays a lot of attention to how we see ourselves, how other people see us, etc. And because I think there's so much social media platforms now, there's a tendency for people to become very self-obsessed and overly concerned with how they look, and overly concerned with their self-image, or at least how they look in the mirror. The feeling that they need to keep up appearances with other people online and show off, etc., get validation. So at this point, in terms of that with health, this is one of the problems I think with orthorexia, is that because it seems plausible, it seems from the outside looking in, he's eating healthy, he's exercising, it looks like a healthy person, he's in shape. Inside, I had like crumbling low self-esteem, socially isolated, incredibly stressed out, affecting my sleep. I actually become slightly agoraphobic. I was afraid to leave the house because my social skills had got so poor, and if I didn't have these safe foods at hand, then I didn't know what was going to happen. So I slowly started transitioning away from this kind of protocol, because I well and truly was sick of being tired, and I very incrementally started watching more videos which were more evidence-based, and then that kind of brought me then full circle of just slowly implementing things very incrementally, because it was so overwhelming, and it seemed so counter-narrative to what I had been told. You have to eat healthy all the time, or your muscle will turn off, you'll all fall off and you'll gain loads of body fat, etc., whatever it is. That with orthorexia, it does seem plausible. It does seem like that is the way, but it's kind of like, I can't remember who said this quote, and I might be paraphrasing it, but we climb these ladders wanting the desire of success, but we sometimes climb these success ladders and only to realize at the top of it that we have the ladder against the wrong wall. It is kind of like that sometimes in life that you really have to just paradigm shift out of it and go in a completely different direction. And there is that kind of ego death that, in a sense, not to sound melodramatic, but it is almost like a grieving process. That part of you, that previous you, is dying. And that you are trying to embrace now a new identity, which is functional, healthier, prosperous, confident, and that you can enjoy life again. And this is why I'm so passionate about this work, is that on the other side of this, if you can get a grip on this, that you can pretty much do so many great things with your life, this will be the platform then that you can enjoy life again. And you don't have to, feel shame and guilt eating foods that you enjoy, or overly restrict your food selection because you think you have to, or because everyone else is telling you, or do what a lot of people do when they suffer from eating disorders. They have this amalgamation of different rules that they've got from loads of different people in the interweb, and then it becomes a bit of a losing battle at some point, because it starts to completely impede your ability to function as a human being. And it isn't always about self-image. I know that, I understand that, I totally get that, but it can be. I think the eating disorders is essentially a symptom. Really, I think this is a symptom of a lot bigger issue at play, which it could be some kind of unconscious, subconscious trauma. It could be some kind of neglect in childhood, not being taught certain things. I think even like having low levels of assertiveness, not being taught about boundaries, can also bring a lot of this stuff. Having that low level of directiveness can lead you then to try and find things to mood alter and get out of feelings. So on the other side of this, the only thing I want to say about this with orthorexia, there is this tendency for people to this is now being labelled the gold standard, and that people are so hell-bent on the quality, and they think that micromanaging their diet to extreme degrees is going to give them this like massive edge over their health and body composition, possibly their performance. In reality, it's not saying that to eat healthy is wrong. That isn't the statement. It's when it's been taken to the extreme that it starts to impede your ability to function, and it starts to reduce your quality of overall life. And for myself, some of the symptoms that you might find are, you lose your ability to eat in an intuitive manner. It might be that you're overly preoccupied with food preparation or looking at food labels. You can't have food unless you've tracked it or it fits within a certain calorie parameter. It might be that you look at foods as only being good or bad, which I've spoken about a lot of times on the channel. That food in itself is not good or bad, it is essentially just food. And really just following the Dietetics Association's principle of that all foods can fit within someone's diet if they're appropriately moderated for that individual. That is a huge thing. So it's saying that everything outside of intolerances, allergies, or personal preference that you just don't like the taste of certain food, every other food is essentially game if you appropriately moderate for yourself and your goal. And then the last little thing I want to say about that is there actually is a point where, because for me, what I was doing, I was still tracking calories and tracking macros when I was transitioning out of the orthorexia stage in my own recovery. Because I was still tracking things, it got to the point where I was, even I just literally just done an interview right now talking about, having this first Subway and how happy I was that I could have that and it was fit into my program, that it wasn't inhibiting anything. I had it in moderation. And then what ended up happening was some time had passed, probably about a year or so, and I started doing things like if it doesn't fit my macros, or if it doesn't fit within my certain calorie means. So say I had 2,000 calories to play with and I had 1,900 calories, and I wanted something larger at the end of the day, and I was hungry, I would say, well, I can't have that. And in more recent years now, I've kind of fallen into patterns of intuitive eating where I kind of base my food preferences, because I do trust myself to make, a wise choice nutritionally and have something that's nutritionally dense the majority of the time. I don't really look at tracking macros as much at the moment. I've based my eating patterns more on my satiety levels and my hunger levels and my appetite from time to time. I have a big appetite, so I have to be careful with that. So I try and get in tune with my body and try and, know that I don't need to obsess on food choices anymore, because I know I'll make it, because of all the practice I've had with my diet, I know what I enjoy, I know that I'll make a wise choice, that my default, because my taste buds have adapted, my default is to usually eat majority healthy with a small wiggle room and margin of flexibility to have the foods that I really enjoy, which might be a bit more refined, and that's okay. As long as you're having it in moderation and, you're not eating until you're completely full or past the point, maybe on occasion, then that's absolutely fine. So that's just a little 2 cents on orthorexia, that it is a very prevalent thing. It is very, because of the whole clean eating movement and because of the way, a lot of programs are set up, and because that adheres to that kind of confirmation bias in a lot of people, that, you have to essentially suffer to get in shape. You have to be so disciplined to make progress and be healthy, because that is so engraved in the kind of public consciousness that when people see a diet, like, oh yeah, that's the silver bullet, that's the thing that I need. You just restrict this, restrict that, all will fall into place, and they forget about all the other aspects of their life, of their relationships, their finances, their social life, their businesses, their hobbies, in the pursuit of this idealized false image, or this idealized false image of what they consider a perfect diet. So, but there is hope. There is something beyond that, and you can get to that place if you are struggling now. By all means, message me, comment me a message in the comments below. Happy to talk here. But yeah, there is a point past all this that you can actually really start to enjoy your life, and you can live beyond all these disordered eating tendencies and live the life you've always wanted. So I hope you guys have enjoyed that video. I really enjoyed recording this. Any comments, leave it below, subscribe, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye bye.